across the endless expanse of the Eurasian steppes, where the horizon stretches beyond sight and sky meets grassland in a seamless blue-green tapestry. The wind carries stories older than memory itself. These vast plains, rolling like a green ocean beneath the dome of heaven, have witnessed the rise and fall of countless peoples, their hoofbeats echoing across generations like distant thunder. Here, in this boundless wilderness of grass and sky, the nomadic tribes of Mongolia lived as they had for 1,000 years, following the ancient rhythms of season and storm, their lives intimately woven into the fabric of the steppe itself. The landscape unfolds in waves of emerald and gold, punctuated by the silver threads of rivers that snake through valleys carved by millennia of wind and rain. In summer, the grasslands bloom with wildflowers that carpet the earth in brilliant splashes of colour, purple lupines, yellow buttercups, and white asters nodding in the constant breeze. The air shimmers with heat mirages that make distant mountains dance like spirits on the horizon, while overhead, the immense bowl of sky stretches from edge to edge of the world, unmarked by tree or hill, painted in shades of azure that deepen to cobalt at the zenith. Winter transforms this same landscape into a realm of crystalline silence, where snow lies deep across the frozen earth, and the wind howls with a voice that speaks of infinity. The rivers become highways of ice, and the grasslands disappear beneath blankets of white that reflect the pale sun like scattered diamonds. In this harsh season, the temperature plunges far below the threshold of human endurance, and survival depends upon the deep wisdom passed down through countless generations of steppe dwellers who learned to read the language of weather and wind, snow and star. The Mongol tribes scattered across these immense grasslands lived in felt-covered dwellings called gurs, circular homes that could be assembled or dismantled in the space of an hour, their wooden frameworks crowned with smoke holes that released the grey ribbons of dung fires into the crisp air. These portable sanctuaries provided warmth and shelter against the extremes of steppe weather, their white felt walls glowing like lanterns in the twilight, scattered across the landscape like stars fallen to earth. Inside these homes, families gathered around central hearths, their faces lit by the dancing flames that cast shifting shadows on felt walls decorated with bright weavings and leather goods that spoke of lives lived in constant motion. The horses of the steppes moved like liquid wind across the grasslands, their hooves drumming a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the land itself. These sturdy animals, small but incredibly hardy, formed the foundation of nomadic life, providing transportation, milk, and meat, their breath steaming in the cold air as they grazed in vast herds that flowed across the landscape like living rivers. The bond between rider and horse transcended mere utility, becoming a partnership forged in the crucible of survival, where man and beast moved as one entity across distances that could span weeks of travel. Sheep and goats followed the horses in great woolly waves, their bells creating a constant gentle music that accompanied the migration of the tribes. Cattle lowed in deeper tones, adding their voices to the symphony of movement that defined nomadic existence. While camels, patient and enduring, carried the heaviest loads with their characteristic swaying gait. The herds moved in response to the availability of grass and water, following patterns established over centuries, their movement choreographed by the wisdom of generations who understood every nuance of the steppe's moods and seasons. The tribal structure of these nomadic peoples reflected the harsh realities of steppe life, where survival depended upon cooperation and mutual support, yet fierce independence remained paramount. Clans traced their lineages through complex genealogies that stretched back to legendary ancestors, their oral histories preserved in songs and stories passed down through generations around the flickering fires of countless winter nights. These extended family groups moved together across the grasslands, their loyalties bound by blood and marriage, their conflicts often as bitter as their alliances were strong. Leadership among the tribes emerged from a combination of birth, ability, and the capacity to command respect among warriors who valued courage above all other virtues. Khans rose and fell based on their success in warfare and their ability to provide for their followers, their authority maintained through a delicate balance of strength and generosity. The great tribal assemblies, called Kurultai, gathered the most important leaders to discuss matters of war and peace. Their deliberations conducted according to traditions that honored both the wisdom of elders and the fierce spirit of youth. Shamanism provided the spiritual framework that guided tribal life. Its practitioners, serving as intermediaries between the visible world of grass and sky and the invisible realm of spirits and ancestors. These holy men and women conducted elaborate rituals that ensured the favor of the eternal blue sky, Tengri, whose vast presence encompassed all existence, and whose will governed the fate of tribes and individuals alike. Sacred sites dotted the landscape, particular mountains, springs, and rock formations that served as focal points for spiritual practice and tribal gatherings. Trade followed ancient routes that crisscrossed the steppes, connecting the nomadic tribes with the settled civilizations that bordered their domain. Merchants from the great cities of the Silk Road ventured onto the grasslands, their caravans protected by treaties and payments that ensured safe passage through tribal territories. The nomads traded horses, furs, and felt goods for tea, silk, and metal implements, these exchanges creating bonds of mutual dependence that sometimes erupted into conflict when agreements were broken or payments delayed. The art of warfare occupied a central place in tribal culture, with every man expected to be a warrior capable of defending his family and clan. Training began in childhood, when boys learned to ride before they could properly walk, their small hands grasping the reins as they clung to the backs of patient mares. The composite bow, curved and deadly accurate, became an extension of the warrior's arm, its arrows capable of bringing down both enemy and prey at distances that seemed impossible to those unfamiliar with steppe archery. Raids and counter-raids formed a constant backdrop to nomadic life, as tribes competed for grazing rights, horses, and honor according to codes that valued bravery and tactical brilliance above mere numbers. The vast emptiness of the steppes bred a people intimately familiar with hardship and endurance, their lives shaped by the constant struggle against cold, hunger, and the violence of both nature and neighboring tribes. Yet this harsh environment also fostered resilience, adaptability, and a fierce love of freedom that would eventually reshape the world. As the 12th century drew toward its close, these scattered tribes remained largely unknown to the great civilizations that flourished beyond the grasslands. Their existence marked only by occasional raids and the exotic goods that trickled into distant markets along the ancient trade routes that connected east and west. From these windswept grasslands emerged a figure whose very name would become synonymous with conquest and transformation. Born into a world where survival hung by the thinnest of threads, the child who would become Genghis Khan entered existence as Temujin, clutching in his tiny fist what the shamans declared to be a clot of blood, an omen that would prove prophetic in ways none could have imagined. The Mongolian steppes showed no mercy to the weak, and the young boy's early years unfolded like a harsh lesson in the brutal arithmetic of nomadic life, where each dawn brought fresh calculations of strength and vulnerability. The vast sky above seemed to press down upon the scattered yurts with indifferent weight, and beneath its endless dome, Temujin's father Yesuge led the Borjigin clan with the steady authority that marked true leaders of the steppes. The elder Khan's presence commanded respect across the tribal territories, his name spoken with the reverence reserved for those who had proven themselves in countless raids and negotiations. Yet even as Yesuge's influence spread like ripples across a still pond, the forces that would shape his son's destiny were already gathering like storm clouds on the horizon, dark with promise and threat in equal measure. When poison claimed Yesuge's life, administered, it was whispered by Tatar enemies who remembered old grievances. The carefully constructed world of the Borjigin clan crumbled like dried grass before wildfire. The tribal confederation that had once looked to Yesuge for leadership scattered to the winds, their loyalty proving as ephemeral as morning mist. Temujin, barely past childhood, watched helplessly as former allies turned their backs on his family, abandoning them to face the merciless steppes alone. The boy who had been heir to a respected lineage suddenly found himself an outcast. His mother, Holun left to guide her children through a landscape that had transformed overnight from familiar territory into hostile wilderness. Starvation became their constant companion during those desperate years, stalking the small family like a patient predator. The winds that swept across the grasslands carried with them the scent of cooking fires from distant camps, tantalizing reminders of the comfort and security that had been stripped away. Holun, drawing upon reserves of strength that seemed to flow from the very earth itself, taught her children to survive on whatever the harsh land offered. Wild onions pulled from the tough soil, fish caught with crude nets in the shallow streams, small game trapped with snares fashioned from whatever materials they could gather. The lessons were harsh but thorough. Each day a masterclass in the fundamental skills that separated the living from the dead on the unforgiving steppes. During these lean years, Temujin's character began to crystallize like ice forming on winter streams. The comfortable assumptions of his early childhood, that food would always appear in the family yurt, that protection was a birthright, that tomorrow would mirror today, dissolved completely under the pressure of constant need. In their place grew something harder and more durable, an understanding that survival demanded not just physical strength, but the ability to read the subtle currents of human nature, to identify opportunity in the most unlikely circumstances, and to strike decisively when the moment presented itself. These were not lessons learned from books or teachers, but truths carved into his very bones by hunger and desperation. The murder of his half-brother Bekta marked a turning point that would echo through history, though few recognized its significance at the time. The dispute arose over something as simple as a fish and a bird, resources too precious to share in their impoverished circumstances. Yet the violence that erupted revealed the cold pragmatism that was already taking root in Temujin's soul. Together with his brother Hassar, he tracked Bekta across the steppes and killed him without hesitation or remorse, demonstrating an early willingness to eliminate threats regardless of blood ties. The act horrified his mother, who saw in it a glimpse of something that chilled her to the bone, but it also served notice that this young outcast possessed qualities that might serve him well in the brutal world they inhabited. Capture came eventually, as it often did for those living on the margins of tribal society. The Taichud clan, remembering old grievances and seeing opportunity in the family's weakened state, seized Temujin and subjected him to the humiliation of the kangwe, a heavy wooden collar that marked him as a prisoner and served as a constant reminder of his powerless condition. The weight of the device pressed down on his shoulders like the accumulated burden of his family's fall from grace. Yet even in bondage, his mind remained active, studying his captors and searching for weaknesses that might be exploited. The Taichud had hoped to break his spirit through this systematic degradation, but they succeeded only in teaching him valuable lessons about the nature of power and the importance of careful planning. Escape, when it finally came, arrived through a combination of patience, cunning, and sheer audacity that would characterize all his future endeavors. On a night when the moon hung like a silver coin against the star-scattered sky, Temujin slipped his bonds and disappeared into the darkness, leaving his captors to discover empty shackles and the bitter taste of their own complacency. The successful flight marked more than just a return to freedom. It represented the first clear demonstration of the strategic thinking and bold execution that would later bring entire civilizations to their knees. Word of his escape spread across the steppes like wildfire, carrying with it whispers that perhaps this young outcast possessed qualities that elevated him above the common run of tribal warriors. The process of rebuilding began slowly, like a fire kindled from the smallest ember. Temujin's early followers were drawn not by promises of immediate wealth or glory, but by something more intangible, yet equally powerful. A sense that this young leader possessed the rare combination of vision and pragmatism necessary to navigate the treacherous currents of steppe politics. His blood brother Jamukha, childhood companion turned rival, watched from a distance as Temujin gathered strength, their relationship growing more complex with each passing season. The bonds between them stretched and strained under the weight of competing ambitions, yet neither could entirely abandon the memories of their shared youth. Marriage to Berthe brought not only personal happiness, but also crucial political alliance. Her family's support providing the foundation upon which larger coalitions could be built. The wedding celebration echoed across the grasslands with traditional songs and the thunder of galloping horses. But the joy proved short-lived when rival claimants struck like wolves in the night. Berthe's kidnapping by the Merkits transformed personal grievance into tribal war, and Temujin's response revealed the cold fury that would become his trademark. The rescue mission that followed demonstrated his growing ability to forge temporary alliances and coordinate complex military operations, skills that would serve him well in the far greater conflicts that lay ahead. Victory followed victory, as Temujin's reputation spread across the steppes like morning light chasing away shadows. Each successful raid brought new followers, warriors drawn by the promise of plunder and the magnetic pull of proven leadership. The young Khan's genius lay not merely in his tactical abilities, though these were considerable, but in his understanding of the fundamental forces that drove nomadic society. He recognized that the endless cycle of raids and counter-raids, alliances and betrayals that had defined steppe life for generations ultimately served no one's interests, except those of enemies who wished to see the tribes remain weak and divided. The great Kurultai, that would elevate him to supreme leadership of all the Mongol tribes, still lay in the future, but already the outlines of that destiny were becoming clear to those with eyes to see. The scattered clans that had once dismissed him as a minor chieftain's son began to recognize something unprecedented in his approach to warfare and governance. Where previous Khans had been content to raid their neighbors and accumulate modest wealth, Temujin spoke of unity and conquest on a scale that stretched the imagination. The vision he articulated in those crucial early years, of a single people united under heaven, riding forth to claim dominion over settled lands beyond the steppes, struck his listeners with the force of revelation, transforming their understanding of what might be possible for those bold enough to seize it. The great Kurultai had spoken, and Temujin emerged as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler whose name would echo across centuries like thunder rolling across endless steppes. The scattered tribes of Mongolia now moved as one vast organism, their felt tents flowing across the grasslands like a sea of white caps beneath an infinite sky. The transformation from fractured clans to unified force had taken place with the inexorable power of rivers converging into a mighty flood, and now this flood sought new channels through which to pour its accumulated strength. Beyond the familiar horizons of the Mongolian plateau lay kingdoms rich with the promise of plunder and glory, their walls gleaming in the morning sun like jeweled crowns waiting to be claimed. The western Shia kingdom stretched along the Silk Roads, where caravans heavy with treasures moved like golden serpents between oasis towns, their bells chiming softly in the desert air. This realm, known to its people as the Great White and High Kingdom, had grown prosperous through centuries of taxing the merchants who carried Chinese silk westward and Islamic goods eastward, their coffers swelling with each transaction that passed through their domain. The Tangut people who ruled western Shia had built their civilization in the shadow of the Chilean mountains, where snow-capped peaks caught the first light of dawn and held it like crystal chalices raised to heaven. Their capital city of Zhongxing rose from the Yellow River Valley like a mirage made manifest, its pagodas and temples reaching skyward in graceful defiance of the surrounding desert. Buddhist monasteries dotted the landscape like scattered pearls, their prayer flags fluttering in the constant wind that swept down from the heights, carrying with it the scent of juniper and the distant promise of rain. For generations, the Tangut rulers had maintained their independence through careful diplomacy and strategic tribute payments, bending like reeds before the stronger winds of Chinese and Khitan pressure, while never breaking entirely. Their armies, though smaller than those of their neighbors, had learned the art of desert warfare with the same patience that their monks had learned to illuminate manuscripts. Each skill honed through repetition and dedication until it achieved a kind of austere perfection. The Tangut cavalry moved through the dunes with the fluid grace of dancers, their horses bred for endurance rather than speed, their riders wrapped in flowing robes that billowed like storm clouds against the endless blue of the desert sky. When news reached the Western Shia court that the Mongol tribes had united under a single Khan, the reaction rippled through the palace chambers like disturbed water. The Tangut Emperor, Liangquan, received these tidings while seated in his throne room, where shafts of golden light filtered through latticed windows, illuminating the intricate woodwork that spoke of centuries of accumulated artistry. The intelligence had travelled along the same routes that carried silk and spices, passed from merchant to merchant until it reached the ears of those who understood its true significance. The initial Mongol approach came not as a thunderous charge, but as a careful probing, like a master archer testing the tension of an unfamiliar bowstring. Genghis Khan dispatched envoys to the Western Shia court, men who rode with the casual confidence of those who had never known defeat, their presence alone carrying an implicit threat more potent than any spoken ultimatum. The message they bore was elegantly simple in its brutality: submit and prosper, or resist and face the consequences that had befallen every tribe that had chosen poorly in the great winnowing of the steppes. The Tangut response revealed the fatal flaw that would ultimately doom their kingdom to the dust of history. Accustomed to the measured diplomacy of settled civilizations, they attempted to negotiate from a position they believed to be strength, offering tribute and recognition while maintaining their fundamental independence. The Western Shia court had grown comfortable in its role as intermediary between great powers, skilled in the delicate art of playing competing interests against one another while harvesting profit from the tensions that swirled around their borders like desert storms. But Genghis Khan had not forged the greatest military machine in human history to settle for tribute and hollow acknowledgements of supremacy. The Mongol war machine had been built for conquest, not diplomacy, and each component of its structure, from the decimal organization of its armies to the harsh discipline that bound every warrior to his commander, had been designed with total victory as its only acceptable outcome. When the Tangut ambassadors returned to their desert kingdom with terms they deemed unacceptable, they unknowingly sealed the fate of their civilization. The Mongol invasion of Western Shia began in the early months of 1209, as winter loosened its grip on the northern steppes, and the spring grass began to carpet the earth with new growth. The assault came not as a single crushing blow, but as a series of carefully coordinated movements, each army flowing like mercury through the gaps in Tangut defenses, while maintaining constant communication through an intricate network of horsemen who moved between the various columns like threads, binding a tapestry together. General Jebe, whose name meant arrow, and whose reputation for swift strikes had earned him a place among Genghis Khan's most trusted commanders, led the vanguard through the Gobi's southern reaches, where the desert met the green valleys of the Yellow River Basin. His 10,000 mounted warriors moved with the disciplined precision of a hunting pack, their composite bows strung and ready, their horses stepping carefully through terrain that could shift from solid earth to treacherous sand without warning. The first Tangut fortress to feel the weight of Mongol fury stood at the junction of two ancient trade routes, its walls built from stones carried down from the mountains by generations of laborers who had believed they were constructing something permanent. The garrison had perhaps 200 men, veteran soldiers who had grown comfortable in their role as customs collectors and border guards, their weapons well maintained, but their skills grown soft through years of facing merchants rather than warriors. The siege lasted exactly 3 days, though calling it a siege misrepresented the nature of what transpired. The Mongols surrounded the fortress like a tightening noose, their siege engines, captured and improved from Chinese designs, hurling stones and fire with methodical precision, while their archers sent volleys of arrows over the walls in deadly arcs that blotted out portions of the sky. When the walls finally cracked and fell, the assault that followed was swift and total, leaving nothing behind but smoke rising into the desert air and carrion birds circling on the thermals. Word of the fortress's fall spread through the western Shi'ar kingdom faster than the Mongol armies themselves, carried by refugees who had witnessed the terrible efficiency of the assault and could speak of little else. The psychological impact proved even more devastating than the military defeat, as garrison after garrison began to surrender without resistance, rather than face the fate that had befallen their comrades. The Tangut military structure, built around static defenses and conventional siege warfare, found itself utterly unprepared for an enemy that moved like wildfire and struck with the concentrated fury of a mountain avalanche. Emperor Li Anquan's attempts to marshal effective resistance resembled a man trying to hold water in cupped hands, each effort seeming to succeed momentarily before dissolving into futility. The traditional Tangut strategy of falling back to prepared positions and forcing prolonged sieges worked only when facing enemies who thought in terms of seasons and harvests, not nomadic warriors for whom mobility represented both tactic and philosophy. The Mongols simply flowed around strongpoints like water around stones, leaving small forces to contain the garrisons, while the main body continued its inexorable advance toward the kingdom's heartland. By the autumn of 1209, Mongol Tumans had penetrated deep into western Shi'ar territory, their passage marked by columns of smoke that rose into the clear desert air like dark prayers offered to some terrible god of war. The great cities that had grown wealthy from centuries of trade now found their walls subjected to siege techniques that combined traditional Mongol mobility with captured Chinese engineering knowledge, creating a hybrid form of warfare that proved devastatingly effective against opponents prepared for neither nomadic raids nor sophisticated siegecraft. The final phase of the Western Shi'ar conquest unfolded with the same remorseless logic that had characterized every aspect of Genghis Khan's rise to power. Emperor Li Anquan, trapped in his capital as Mongol forces tightened around the city like the coils of an enormous serpent, finally sued for peace from a position of such weakness that surrender represented his only remaining option. The terms imposed upon the defeated kingdom reflected Genghis Khan's understanding that true conquest required not merely military victory, but the complete transformation of the conquered people into instruments of further expansion. Western Shi'ar would survive as a vassal state, its armies now bound to serve Mongol interests, its treasuries open to fund future campaigns, its very existence dependent upon continued submission to the universal Khan, whose shadow had fallen across their ancient kingdom like an eclipse that would never end. With the Western Shi'ar kingdom reduced to smouldering ruins, and its people scattered like seeds on the autumn wind, Genghis Khan turned his calculating gaze eastward toward the mighty Jin dynasty, where gleaming cities rose behind walls that had stood unconquered for centuries. The Jin, descendants of the Jurchen people who had carved their empire from the northern reaches of China, commanded vast armies and possessed fortifications that seemed to mock the very notion of siege. Their capital at Zhongdu, present-day Beijing, sprawled across the landscape like a stone leviathan, its walls stretching toward the horizon in an unbroken line of defiance against any who would dare approach. The Mongol horsemen, their ponies still bearing the dust of Western Shi'ar's final battlefields, gazed upon these towering ramparts with eyes that had learned to see opportunity where others saw impossibility. Behind those walls lay treasures beyond imagination, silk warehouses that could clothe entire armies, granaries that could feed nations, and workshops where master craftsmen created wonders in bronze and iron. Yet between the mounted warriors and these prizes stood barriers of stone and earth that rose like artificial mountains, crowned with towers where Jin sentries maintained their eternal watch. Genghis Khan understood that the tactics which had served him so well against the Shi'ar, swift cavalry charges and the psychological warfare of devastating raids, would shatter like morning frost against these monumental fortifications. The Jin had spent generations perfecting their defensive architecture, learning from every siege their ancestors had weathered. Their engineers had crafted walls that curved and angled to deflect the force of battering rams, had dug moats that could swallow entire cavalry formations, and had positioned their towers to create overlapping fields of fire that could turn any approach into a killing ground. The solution came not from the steppes of Mongolia, but from the very lands the Mongols had already conquered. Among the survivors of Western Xia's collapse were engineers and siege specialists who possessed knowledge that the nomadic warriors had never needed. The ancient arts of toppling walls and breaking gates that had been perfected over centuries of Chinese warfare. These men, their loyalties now bound to their Mongol conquerors through a mixture of pragmatism and fear, brought with them the blueprints for weapons that could reach across vast distances and strike with the force of thunderbolts. Under their guidance, the Mongol camps transformed into workshops where the rhythmic hammering of metal on metal echoed through the night air like some primordial heartbeat. Massive siege engines began to take shape, towering trebuchets that stood as tall as ancient trees, their wooden frames groaning under the tension of twisted sinews and braided ropes. These mechanical giants could hurl stones the size of oxen across impossible distances, sending them arcing through the sky like meteoric harbingers of destruction before they crashed down upon walls and towers with earth-shaking impact. The catapults that accompanied these trebuchets were marvels of engineering precision, their bronze mechanisms calibrated to deliver death with mathematical certainty. Craftsmen worked by torchlight to balance counterweights and adjust tensions, their movements deliberate and reverent as priests preparing sacred rituals. The ammunition for these engines came from the very lands they sought to conquer. Massive stones quarried from nearby mountains, their surfaces still bearing the scars of the hammers and chisels that had shaped them for their deadly purpose. As these siege engines took their positions around Jin strongholds, they created a new kind of landscape, a mechanical forest of war machines stretching across the horizon. The trebuchets stood like wooden titans, their arms reaching toward the sky as if supplicating some ancient god of war. Between them, mangonels crouched low to the ground like patient predators, their bowls loaded with clusters of smaller stones that could shred wooden palisades and scatter defending soldiers like leaves before a hurricane. The air around these engines hummed with constant activity as crews made endless adjustments, checking rope tensions and confirming trajectories with the methodical precision of master craftsmen. The first bombardments began at dawn, when the morning mist still clung to the walls of the besieged cities like ghostly shrouds. The trebuchets released their loads with thunderous crashes that rolled across the countryside like the footsteps of giants, each stone tracing a perfect arc through the pale sky before striking home with devastating force. The sound of impact carried for miles, a deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, followed by the distant crash of collapsing masonry and the faint cries of those caught within. Day after day, the bombardment continued with mechanical relentlessness, each stone finding its mark with increasing precision as the Mongol engineers refined their aim. The Jin walls, built to withstand the battering rams and scaling ladders of traditional warfare, had never been designed to endure this kind of systematic pounding from above. Massive blocks of granite that had stood unmoved for generations began to crack and shift under the relentless assault, their mortar joints crumbling like sand as the very structure of the fortifications began to fail. The psychological impact of this sustained bombardment proved as devastating as the physical damage. Jin defenders, who had trained their entire lives to repel attacks from ground level, found themselves helpless against this rain of death from above. The stones fell with no warning beyond the distant crash of the trebuchet's release, giving those within the walls mere seconds to seek shelter before destruction arrived. Sleep became impossible as the bombardment continued through the night hours, the defenders huddling in whatever cover they could find while their world crumbled around them, stone by stone. Beyond the walls, Mongol strategy encompassed more than mere destruction. Genghis Khan had learned from his Chinese advisors the subtle art of siege warfare, how to strangle a city's supply lines while simultaneously offering hope of survival to those willing to surrender. The siege engines provided the thunder and devastation that broke the defenders' spirits, but it was the careful orchestration of blockades and negotiations that ultimately opened the gates. Mongol forces surrounded each target completely, cutting off every route of escape or resupply, while envoys rode forward under flags of truce to offer terms that grew less generous with each passing day. The fall of each Jin stronghold followed a pattern that became as predictable as the changing seasons. First came the bombardment, systematically destroying sections of wall and tower until gaps appeared in the defences. Then came the psychological pressure as food supplies dwindled and the constant threat of death from above wore down the defenders' resolve. Finally came the moment when the city's leaders, faced with the choice between continued resistance and total annihilation, would send their own envoys to negotiate surrender terms that might preserve at least some lives among their people. The siege engines that had begun as desperate innovations became the foundation of a new form of warfare that would echo across centuries. The Mongols had discovered that walls, no matter how massive or well-built, were merely obstacles to be overcome through superior engineering and relentless application of force. The Jin dynasty, which had seemed as permanent and immovable as the mountains themselves, crumbled fortress by fortress, until even their greatest strongholds stood empty and broken, their defenders either dead or scattered to the winds, their treasures flowing eastward in an endless stream of tribute to the Khan, who had learned to break stone with stone and time with patience. The great war machines that had brought the Jin dynasty to its knees would soon find new purpose across the vast steppes that stretched westward from the Middle Kingdom. As the last of the Chinese fortifications crumbled beneath the relentless hammering of Mongol siege engines, Genghis Khan's gaze was already turning toward distant horizons, where the morning sun cast long shadows across territories that had never known the thunder of his horse's hooves. The year 1219 marked not merely the end of one campaign, but the beginning of a westward tide that would reshape the very foundations of the known world. The Khwarezmian Empire stretched like a jeweled belt across the heart of Asia, its boundaries encompassing the ancient cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and the glittering capital of Gurganj. For centuries, these urban centres had stood as beacons of learning and commerce, their bazaars filled with the mingled scents of saffron and sandalwood, their libraries containing the accumulated wisdom of Persian scholars and Arab mathematicians. The empire's ruler, Ala ad-Din Muhammad II, commanded territories that extended from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, controlling trade routes that carried silk from China and spices from India through the great commercial arteries of the Islamic world. His armies were numerous, and his cities well fortified, their walls rising like stone cliffs above fertile river valleys where irrigation channels had transformed desert wastes into gardens of abundance. The catalyst for the coming storm arrived in the form of a merchant caravan, its camels heavy with Chinese silk, silver ingots, and precious stones. Genghis Khan had dispatched this embassy not merely as traders, but as harbingers of a new diplomatic relationship, carrying with them letters written on silk that spoke of friendship and mutual prosperity. The caravan wound its way along the ancient Silk Road, passing through oasis towns where date palms swayed in desert winds and water sparkled in ancient wells carved from living rock. At Otrar, a frontier city that commanded one of the great crossing points between the steppe and the settled lands, the merchants presented their credentials to Inalchuk Kaya Khan, the governor whose palace overlooked the convergence of two great rivers. What transpired within those palace walls would echo across centuries like thunder rolling across empty plains. The governor, whether driven by suspicion, greed, or simple miscalculation, ordered the execution of the entire caravan. The merchants died far from their homeland, their blood seeping into foreign soil, while their goods were distributed among local officials who believed themselves beyond the reach of steppe justice. When word of this atrocity reached the great Khan's court, carried by a single survivor who had witnessed the massacre from hiding, the response was as inevitable as winter following autumn. The diplomatic overture that followed carried within it the weight of approaching catastrophe. Genghis Khan's ambassador arrived at the Khwarezmian court, bearing demands that resonated with the authority of one who had never known defeat. The great Khan required the surrender of Inalchuk and compensation for the murdered merchants, terms that acknowledged Mongol sovereignty while offering the Shah a path toward peaceful resolution. Shah Muhammad's response revealed the fatal miscalculation that would doom his empire. He executed the ambassador and sent his escorts back to Mongolia with their beards shaven, a gesture of contempt that sealed the fate of millions who would perish in the years to come. The Mongol war machine that rolled westward in 1219 represented the culmination of decades of military evolution, its components refined through countless battles across the steppes and perfected during the long campaigns against the Jin dynasty. 200,000 horsemen moved in coordinated columns across landscapes that had never witnessed such organized destruction, their advance preceded by clouds of scouts who mapped every water source, every mountain pass, every fortress that might offer resistance. The siege engines that had battered down Chinese walls now rumbled on wooden wheels across the Central Asian plateau, dismantled and transported with the methodical precision that characterized every aspect of Mongol warfare. Otrar, the city where the merchant caravan had met its doom, became the first target of a vengeance that would reshape the political geography of Asia. The siege began with the systematic encirclement of the settlement, Mongol engineers studying the angles of its walls and the placement of its towers, with the patient attention of craftsmen examining a complex mechanism. The defenders, peering down from their battlements, saw an enemy that employed not merely superior numbers, but innovative tactics that combined traditional steppe mobility with sophisticated siegecraft learned from Chinese and Persian engineers, who now served the Mongol cause. The assault on Otrar unfolded with the inexorable rhythm of a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction. Catapults hurled massive stones that shattered ancient masonry, while Chinese fire arrows traced burning arcs across the darkening sky, setting wooden structures ablaze within the city's heart. The defenders fought with the desperate courage of men who understood that no quarter would be given. Their arrows falling like rain upon the attacking masses, while boiling oil poured from the walls to splash against Mongol shields and scaling ladders. For 5 months, the siege continued, winter snow covering the battlefield, where frozen corpses lay scattered like broken dolls, until spring thaws revealed the true extent of the carnage. When Otrar finally fell, its capture marked not merely a military victory, but the beginning of a systematic campaign of terror designed to break the will of every city that might consider resistance. Inalchuk, the governor whose actions had precipitated this catastrophe, was executed with silver poured into his eyes and ears, a death that carried symbolic meaning for those who had shown such disregard for the sacred bonds of diplomacy and commerce. The city itself was razed with such thoroughness that later travelers would struggle to identify where its walls had once stood, the accumulated culture of centuries reduced to rubble and ash that would blow across the steppes for generations to come. The pattern established at Otrar would be repeated across the breadth of the Khwarezmian Empire as Mongol armies advanced along multiple axes, their movements coordinated with the precision that had characterized their campaigns in China. Bukhara, the city that had once been called the Pillar of Islam, opened its gates after witnessing the fate of settlements that had chosen resistance. The Mongol occupation transformed this center of Islamic learning into a stable for their horses, the Great Mosque serving as a warehouse for fodder, while scholars and merchants watched in horror as their libraries were stripped for kindling and their carefully tended gardens trampled beneath the hooves of steppe ponies. Samarkand, perhaps the greatest commercial center of the age, endured a siege that lasted only 5 days before its walls were breached by engines that hurled stones the size of mill wheels with devastating accuracy. The city's artisans, craftsmen who had created objects of surpassing beauty from precious metals and jewels, were separated from the general population and marched eastward toward Mongolia, where their skills would serve new masters in distant lands. The remainder of the population faced a fate that had become grimly familiar across the region: systematic execution carried out with the bureaucratic efficiency that the Mongols applied to every aspect of their campaigns. The destruction of these ancient urban centers represented more than mere military conquest. It marked the erasure of cultural achievements that had accumulated over centuries of continuous development. Libraries containing works of philosophy, mathematics, and poetry that represented the pinnacle of Islamic civilization were reduced to ashes, their contents lost forever as flames consumed centuries of human intellectual achievement. Irrigation systems that had sustained agricultural communities for generations were systematically destroyed, their channels filled with rubble, and their distribution networks shattered beyond repair, leaving behind landscapes that would remain barren for decades. The westward tide of Mongol conquest reached its crescendo with the siege of Gurganj, the Khwarezmian capital that stood like a final bastion against the approaching storm. This great city, built where the Amu Darya River approached the Aral Sea, had grown wealthy from its position controlling trade between Europe and Asia. Its massive walls, reinforced over generations of intermittent warfare, rose above a complex urban landscape where palaces, mosques, and commercial districts testified to centuries of prosperity and cultural achievement. The siege of Gurganj would prove to be one of the most prolonged and devastating of the entire campaign, its fall marking the final extinction of the Khwarezmian Empire and the completion of a conquest that had transformed the political balance of the known world. As the dust settled over the ruins of Samarkand and the ashes of Bukhara cooled beneath the endless Central Asian sky, the great Khan Genghis felt the weight of his years pressing upon his shoulders like the accumulated snow of a dozen winters. The Western campaigns had stretched the Mongol war machine to its very limits, carrying death and transformation across distances that defied comprehension. Yet even as his armies consolidated their grip on the shattered remnants of Khwarezmia, the aging conqueror's thoughts turned eastward once more, toward the vast expanse of his homeland, and the question that haunted every great empire builder since time immemorial: who would inherit this unprecedented dominion over earth and sky? The succession had been decided years before, not through the ancient customs of primogeniture that governed settled kingdoms, but through the calculating wisdom of a nomad chief who understood that empires lived or died by the strength of their leadership. Ögedei, the third son, possessed neither the fierce charisma of Jotchi nor the scholarly inclinations of Tolui, but rather something far more valuable in the eyes of his father: a steady temperament coupled with an administrator's mind for the intricate machinery of governance. When the great Khan's spirit finally departed this world in the summer of 1227, riding the eternal winds across the steppes of eternity, it was Ögedei who emerged from the Kurultai as the chosen successor, his broad shoulders now bearing the accumulated dreams and ambitions of a people who had transformed themselves from scattered tribes into the masters of half the known world. The new Khan ascended to power with the methodical precision that would define his reign, understanding instinctively that the explosive conquests of his father's era required a different kind of leadership. Not the lightning strike of the nomad warrior, but the patient construction of systems that could transform conquest into lasting dominion. Where Genghis had been the storm that swept across the world, Ögedei would become the foundation upon which that storm's achievements could be built into something permanent and enduring. His court at Karakorum began to take shape as something unprecedented in Mongol history. Not merely a seasonal gathering place for the tribe, but a true capital city where the business of governing an empire could be conducted with the sophistication that such vast territories demanded. The administrative reforms that flowed from Ögedei's court revealed a mind that grasped the essential challenge facing the Mongols in this new phase of their expansion. Raw military prowess, however overwhelming, could not by itself transform a confederation of nomadic tribes into the governing apparatus required to rule settled agricultural societies across vast distances. The Khan surrounded himself with advisors drawn from every corner of the known world: Chinese scholars whose ancestors had served the Tang dynasty, Persian administrators who understood the complexities of taxation and trade, Khitan bureaucrats who brought centuries of experience in managing the delicate relationship between nomadic rulers and sedentary subjects. This cosmopolitan court conducting its business in a dozen languages and following customs that blended traditions from across Eurasia, became the beating heart of an empire that was learning to govern as skillfully as it had learned to conquer. Yet even as Ögedei laboured to create the institutional framework for lasting empire, his gaze turned inevitably toward the greatest prize that remained beyond Mongol control: the Song dynasty of southern China. That ancient and sophisticated realm that represented perhaps the highest flowering of human civilization in the medieval world. The Song emperors ruled over territories that contained perhaps 60 million souls, protected by armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and defended by fortifications that had withstood every assault for generations. Their cities gleamed with prosperity, generated by trade networks that stretched from the South China Sea to the merchants of Central Asia. Their scholars pursued learning in academies that had preserved and expanded upon the wisdom of ages, and their artisans created works of beauty that commanded admiration even among the Mongols, those supremely practical people who generally valued function above form. The decision to launch a systematic campaign against the Song represented a fundamental shift in Mongol strategic thinking, moving beyond the opportunistic raids and quick conquests that had characterized the earlier phases of expansion. This would not be another lightning campaign like the destruction of Khwarezmia, but rather a patient, methodical reduction of enemy strength that might require decades to complete. Ögedei understood that the Song possessed advantages that no previous enemy had enjoyed: vast population reserves that could replace losses, economic resources that dwarfed those of any nomadic confederation, and most crucially, centuries of experience in defending fixed positions against nomadic incursions. The systematic nature of Chinese administration, with its detailed records and efficient taxation systems, meant that Song resistance would not collapse suddenly, like the more loosely organized societies the Mongols had previously encountered. The opening phases of the Song campaign revealed the extent to which Mongol military doctrine had evolved under Ögedei's leadership. Gone were the purely cavalry-based tactics that had served so well against the armies of the steppes and the lightly fortified cities of Central Asia. Chinese engineers, many of them defectors from the Jin dynasty that had already fallen to Mongol pressure, brought with them knowledge of siege warfare that transformed the capabilities of Mongol armies. Massive catapults capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds began to appear in the Mongol order of battle, alongside sophisticated devices for undermining walls and techniques for conducting prolonged sieges that could reduce even the strongest fortifications to rubble. The psychological warfare that had always been a Mongol specialty took on new dimensions in the Chinese campaigns, adapted to exploit the particular vulnerabilities of a highly literate urban civilization. Where the destruction of nomadic camps had required only physical force, the reduction of Chinese cities demanded a more subtle approach that could break the will of defenders while preserving the administrative and economic infrastructure that made those cities valuable as imperial assets. Mongol commanders learned to combine overwhelming military pressure with diplomatic overtures that offered generous terms to cities that submitted promptly, while ensuring that news of what befell those who resisted spread quickly through the intricate communication networks that connected Chinese urban centers. The rivers of southern China posed challenges that Mongol armies had never before encountered on such a scale. These were not the seasonal streams of the steppes or the modest waterways of Central Asia, but mighty torrents that could only be crossed at specific points and whose control could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. The Mongols found themselves compelled to master new forms of warfare: naval combat on vessels designed for river operations, the construction of floating bridges capable of supporting cavalry units, and the complex logistics of maintaining supply lines across water barriers that could be disrupted by enemy action at any moment. Chinese naval forces, operating from bases that had been fortified over centuries, proved far more formidable opponents than anything the Mongols had previously faced on water. The economic dimensions of the Song campaign revealed perhaps most clearly how far Mongol thinking had evolved since the days when warriors measured success simply in terms of plunder and captives. Ogedai's advisors understood that the true wealth of China lay not in portable treasures that could be loaded onto pack horses, but in the productive capacity of millions of farmers working irrigated fields, of artisans creating goods that commanded premium prices across international markets, and of merchants whose trading networks generated steady streams of revenue through taxation. The challenge facing Mongol administrators was to maintain these complex economic systems while adapting them to serve the needs of a nomadic empire whose power base remained firmly rooted in the pastoral societies of the northern steppes. As the years of systematic pressure took their toll on Song resistance, patterns began to emerge that would characterize Mongol governance throughout their vast domains. Local elites who demonstrated their usefulness to the new regime found themselves incorporated into the imperial administration, often retaining significant authority over their traditional spheres of influence, while accepting ultimate subordination to Mongol oversight. The cosmopolitan character of Ogedai's court extended itself into the occupied territories, where Chinese officials worked alongside Mongol administrators, Persian merchants, and scholars from across Eurasia in a system of governance that was perhaps the most internationally diverse the world had yet seen. This blending of traditions and expertise created administrative innovations that would influence the development of government across Asia for centuries to come, as the Mongol Empire became a vast laboratory for political and economic experimentation on an unprecedented scale. The conquest of the Song dynasty under Ogedai Khan thus represented far more than another military triumph in the Mongol catalogue of victories. It marked the transformation of a nomadic confederation into a true world empire, capable not merely of destroying existing order, but of constructing new systems of governance that could endure across generations. As Mongol banners flew over cities whose history stretched back beyond memory, the empire entered a new phase of its existence, one in which the skills of administration would prove as crucial as the arts of war in determining whether this vast dominion would endure or fragment like so many ambitious conquests before it. The death of Ogedai Khan in 1241 marked not an end, but a momentary pause in the great wheel of Mongol expansion, like the brief stillness between the flash of lightning and the rumble of thunder that follows. While the Kurultai gathered in distant Karakorum to select the next great Khan, the momentum of conquest continued to pulse through the western reaches of the empire, where Batu Khan and his magnificent war machine had already turned their gaze toward the vast forests and golden plains that stretched beyond the Ural Mountains. The Russian principalities lay scattered across this immense landscape, like islands in a sea of birch and pine, each ruled by princes who traced their lineage back to the legendary Rurik, each convinced of their own invincibility behind walls of timber and stone. Kiev stood as the jewel among these settlements, its golden domes catching the morning light like burnished shields, its markets bustling with merchants who carried furs and amber along the ancient trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Black Sea. The princes of Moscow, Novgorod, and Ryazan maintained their feudal disputes and petty rivalries, entirely unaware that a force unlike anything their ancestors had ever faced was already moving through the mountain passes of the Caucasus. The Mongol war machine that descended upon the Russian lands was a creation of terrible beauty, honed by decades of conquest across the steppes of Central Asia and the rice paddies of China. At its heart rode the heavy cavalry, armoured warriors mounted on horses bred for endurance across vast distances, their composite bows capable of sending arrows through chainmail at ranges that European knights could scarcely comprehend. These riders moved not in the disorganized charges beloved of Western warfare, but in disciplined formations that flowed across the landscape like water finding its course. Each unit responding to signals from horsehair banners and the deep-throated calls of curved horns that echoed across miles of open country. Behind the cavalry came the siege engines, those mechanical marvels that the Mongols had perfected through their encounters with Chinese military engineers and Persian craftsmen. enormous catapults capable of hurling stones the size of millstones, siege towers that could be assembled and disassembled with remarkable speed, and most fearsome of all, the Chinese fire weapons that could turn wooden fortifications into infernos that burned for days. The logistics train that supported this army stretched for dozens of miles, a serpentine procession of wagons, pack animals, and spare horses that moved with the precision of a clockwork mechanism across terrain that would have defeated lesser forces. Ryazan fell first, in the winter of 1237, its wooden walls offering no more resistance to Mongol siegecraft than morning frost offers to the rising sun. The battle lasted only days, but the methodical destruction that followed served as both practical conquest and psychological warfare, sending streams of refugees fleeing northward with tales of impossible horsemen who could strike from any direction, and war machines that could reduce stone towers to rubble. Moscow followed within weeks, its young prince fleeing into the forests with whatever retainers he could gather, leaving behind a city that burned against the white snow like a beacon visible for miles across the frozen landscape. The advance toward Kiev proceeded with the inexorable rhythm of a summer thunderstorm moving across open plains, gathering strength and momentum as it rolled forward. Mongol scouts ranged far ahead of the main force, their hardy ponies carrying them through forests where European horses would have foundered, along rivers that served as highways through the wilderness, across marshlands that swallowed armies but proved navigable to warriors raised in the wetlands of the Mongolian plateau. These advance riders brought back detailed intelligence about every fortress, every river crossing, every cache of supplies that might sustain their brothers in the great host that followed. The siege of Kiev began in the autumn of 1240, when the golden leaves of the steppe maples were falling like coins scattered by a careless merchant. The city's magnificent walls, built of stone quarried from the banks of the Dnieper, had withstood previous assaults by neighboring princes and nomadic raiders, but they had never faced the concentrated fury of Mongol military engineering. Day after day, the great catapults hurled their loads of stone and fire into the city, each impact sending tremors through the earth that could be felt miles away, each crash accompanied by the splintering of timbers and the distant cries of those caught beneath falling masonry. Within the city walls, Prince Michael Vsevolodovich and his retainers prepared for the final assault with the grim determination of men who understood that surrender offered no more safety than resistance. The great cathedral of St. Sophia, with its soaring domes and brilliant mosaics, became a refuge for citizens who brought their most precious possessions and their most fervent prayers, transforming the sacred space into a scene that might have been lifted from the pages of an illuminated manuscript depicting the end of days. The final assault came with the dawn, preceded by a barrage of arrows so dense that they darkened the sky like a cloud of locusts descending upon a harvest field. Mongol warriors poured through the breaches in the walls like water through a broken dam, their war cries echoing off the stone buildings in harmonies that spoke of steppes and mountains far beyond the comprehension of their European adversaries. The battle for the streets lasted until nightfall, a brutal affair of house-to-house fighting that turned every doorway into a fortress and every market square into a battlefield. From the smoking ruins of Kiev, the Mongol tide rolled westward into lands where Latin was spoken in the churches, and feudal knights regarded themselves as the pinnacle of military prowess. Poland lay before them like a rich tapestry spread upon the earth, its cities connected by ancient trade routes, its countryside dotted with the wooden towers of noble estates and the stone keeps of warrior bishops who combined spiritual authority with temporal power. The Battle of Mohi, fought on the plains of Hungary in April 1241, demonstrated with devastating clarity the obsolescence of European military tactics when faced with the refined warfare of the steppes. King Bela IV had assembled what he believed to be an invincible force of heavily armoured knights, their war horses draped in silk and steel, their lances gleaming like a forest of silver in the morning light. The flower of Hungarian nobility rode in their ranks, young men who had trained since childhood in the arts of mounted combat, and who regarded war as the ultimate expression of aristocratic virtue. Batu Khan's response was to divide his forces with the precision of a master chess player, sending one wing across the Sajo River in darkness, while holding the main force in reserve, allowing the Hungarian army to position itself exactly where Mongol strategy demanded. When dawn broke over the battlefield, the Europeans found themselves facing not a simple charge of barbarian horsemen, but a sophisticated tactical maneuver that had been perfected across 1,000 miles of conquest from the Yellow River to the Carpathian Mountains. The Mongol composite bows sent their arrows in high arcs that fell among the Hungarian knights like deadly rain, each shaft capable of penetrating chainmail at distances that rendered European weapons useless. As the heavy cavalry struggled to close with their tormentors, they found themselves drawn into carefully prepared killing fields where superior mobility and coordinated tactics turned their strength into weakness, their numbers into liability, their courage into merely another casualty of war. The aftermath of Mohi sent shockwaves through the courts of Western Europe, where kings and emperors suddenly understood that their eastern borders faced a threat unlike any they had previously contemplated. Pope Gregory IX called for crusade, but his words carried across a continent already exhausted by decades of religious warfare and political fragmentation, falling upon ears that heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats in every wind that blew from the steppes. The thunder that had shaken the foundations of Kiev and echoed across the frozen rivers of Russia began to settle into a different rhythm as the great wheel of Mongol conquest turned toward a new phase of mastery. In the wake of those devastating campaigns that had left European chroniclers scrambling to comprehend the scope of destruction, the empire that stretched from the Pacific shores to the gates of Vienna found itself facing challenges that could not be solved by the swift strike of arrows or the coordinated charge of 10,000 horsemen. The very success of Mongol arms had created a realm so vast that its administration required skills as sophisticated as any military stratagem. And it was into this complex world of governance that Mongol Khan stepped when he ascended to the throne of the Great Khanate in 1251. The selection of Mongol marked a pivotal transformation in the character of Mongol rule, for unlike his predecessors, whose reigns had been defined primarily by expansion and conquest, this new Khan inherited an empire that had grown beyond the capacity of traditional steppe governance to manage effectively. Grandson of Genghis Khan through his son Tolui, Mongol brought to the throne a temperament more suited to the patient work of consolidation than the fierce joy of battle. His court, established in the rebuilt capital of Karakorum, became a center of administrative innovation, where the practical challenges of ruling sedentary populations thousands of miles from the Mongolian heartland required solutions that drew from Chinese, Persian, and Islamic traditions of governance. Under Mongol's careful hand, the empire that had been held together primarily by personal loyalty to successive khans and the shared culture of the steppes began to develop the institutional framework necessary for long-term stability. The decimal system of military organization that had served so well in conquest was adapted for civilian administration, with officials appointed to oversee units of households numbering in the thousands and 10,000s. Tax collection, which had previously been largely a matter of tribute extraction and plunder, evolved into sophisticated systems that drew upon the administrative expertise of conquered civilizations while maintaining the efficiency that Mongol rule demanded. The Great Census undertaken during Mongol's reign represented perhaps the most ambitious administrative project attempted by any medieval state. From the rice paddies of southern China to the trading cities along the Silk Road, Mongol officials worked with local administrators to count every household, every craftsman, every acre of cultivated land. This vast undertaking, carried out with methodical precision across territories that encompassed dozens of distinct cultures and languages, provided the foundation for a taxation system that could support the empire's military apparatus while funding the infrastructure projects that bound the far-flung territories together. It was during this period of administrative consolidation that the empire began to take on the characteristics of a true world state, rather than simply an expanded tribal confederation. The Pax Mongolica that emerged under Mongol's rule created conditions for trade and cultural exchange on a scale never before seen in human history. Merchants from Venice could travel safely to Beijing, carrying letters of credit honored in Mongol courts from Persia to China. Scholars and artisans moved freely along routes protected by Mongol armies, carrying with them techniques and ideas that cross-pollinated civilizations separated by thousands of miles. When Kublai Khan assumed power following Mongol's death in 1259, he inherited not only the vast territorial holdings of his predecessor, but also the sophisticated administrative machinery that had been developed to govern them. Kublai, however, brought to the throne a vision that went beyond mere consolidation. His reign would mark the full flowering of Mongol administrative genius, particularly in China, where he established the Yuan dynasty and transformed the nature of imperial governance in ways that would influence Chinese political development for centuries to come. The court that Kublai established first in Kaiping and later in the magnificent new capital of Dadu demonstrated the sophisticated fusion of Mongol military tradition with Chinese bureaucratic expertise that characterized his approach to rule. The palace complex that rose from the plains south of modern Beijing represented more than mere architectural grandeur. It embodied a new conception of imperial authority that drew upon the ceremonial traditions of Chinese emperors while maintaining the accessibility and direct leadership style that had characterized Mongol Khans from the time of Genghis. The administrative innovations implemented under Kublai's rule reflected a deep understanding of the challenges inherent in governing a population that vastly outnumbered their Mongol rulers. The system of dual administration that emerged during his reign allowed Chinese officials to handle the day-to-day business of governance, while Mongol nobles retained ultimate authority over military matters and major policy decisions. This careful balance preserved Mongol political dominance while harnessing the administrative skills of the Chinese literati class, creating a form of collaborative governance that enabled efficient rule over the world's largest population. The economic policies pursued during Kublai's reign demonstrated an understanding of statecraft that went far beyond the simple extraction of tribute that had characterized earlier phases of Mongol rule. The introduction of paper currency, backed by the authority of the Great Khan and enforced throughout the empire's trading networks, represented one of the most sophisticated monetary innovations of the medieval period. This system allowed for economic integration on a continental scale, facilitating trade relationships that spanned from the spice markets of Southeast Asia to the trading posts of the Black Sea. Agricultural policy under Kublai reflected the same careful attention to the practical requirements of governing settled populations. The extensive irrigation projects undertaken during his reign, drawing upon both Chinese hydraulic engineering expertise and the organizational capabilities of the Mongol administrative system, increased agricultural productivity throughout northern China. The careful attention paid to granary systems and famine relief demonstrated how thoroughly the Mongols had adapted their governance to the needs of agricultural societies whose survival depended upon careful management of resources and preparation for seasonal variations. The cultural flowering that occurred during the Yuan dynasty under Kublai's patronage represented perhaps the most remarkable transformation of Mongol rule. The court that had once been characterized primarily by the austere military culture of the steppes became a center of artistic and intellectual achievement that drew scholars, artists, and craftsmen from across the known world. The synthesis of artistic traditions that emerged during this period, blending Chinese, Persian, Central Asian, and even European influences, created cultural forms that were truly cosmopolitan in character. The religious tolerance that had characterized Mongol rule from its earliest days found its most sophisticated expression under Kublai's administration. The court maintained Buddhist monks, Taoist masters, Islamic scholars, and Christian missionaries, each group free to practice and promote their beliefs while serving the administrative needs of the empire. This pluralistic approach to religious affairs reflected not merely pragmatic accommodation, but a genuine appreciation for the diverse traditions that enriched the cultural life of the empire. The legacy of administrative mastery, established during the reigns of Mongke and Kublai, extended far beyond the immediate needs of Mongol governance. The systems of census-taking, taxation, and bureaucratic organization that they developed influenced administrative practices throughout Asia for centuries. The integration of diverse cultural traditions within a single governmental framework provided a model for later empires that faced similar challenges of governing multi-ethnic populations across vast territories. As the empire reached the zenith of its administrative sophistication under Kublai's rule, the transformation from a confederation of nomadic tribes into the world's most powerful and efficiently governed state represented one of the most remarkable political achievements in human history. The blood and fire that had marked the empire's expansion had given way to the patient work of administration, creating institutions that would outlast the military campaigns that had brought them into being, and leaving an indelible mark upon the political development of Asia. The vast Mongol Empire, stretching from the steppes of Mongolia to the palaces of China, had grown accustomed to the rhythm of horses' hooves thundering across endless grasslands and the crack of siege engines against city walls. Under Kublai Khan's reign, however, the empire began to turn its gaze beyond the familiar territories of land toward the mysterious expanses of water that had long remained unconquered. The maritime expeditions that followed would test the very limits of Mongol ambition, proving that even the most formidable military machine in history could find itself humbled by forces beyond its control. The transition from Mongke's administrative consolidation to Kublai's maritime ambitions unfolded like the changing of seasons across the empire. Where Mongke had focused on strengthening the internal structures of conquered territories, Kublai's vision extended outward, drawn by the allure of islands that sparkled like jewels across the South China Sea. The Chinese naval traditions, now under Mongol command, whispered tales of wealthy kingdoms beyond the waves: Japan, with its legendary warriors and rich temples, and the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia, where merchants spoke of treasures that rivaled those found in the greatest continental cities. The preparation for these maritime campaigns required a fundamental shift in Mongol military thinking. For generations, the empire's strength had resided in the mobility of mounted archers, the coordination of massive cavalry charges, and the psychological impact of thundering hoofbeats approaching distant cities. Now, shipyards along the Chinese coast echoed with the sound of hammers and saws as thousands of vessels took shape under grey skies, heavy with sea mist. Korean shipbuilders, conscripted into service, worked alongside Chinese craftsmen to create a fleet that would carry Mongol ambitions across waters that had never felt the weight of their conquest. The first great maritime venture targeted Japan, that distant archipelago which had long existed in splendid isolation, protected by the treacherous waters of the Korean Strait. In 1274, the invasion fleet assembled like a floating city along the Korean coastline, its hundreds of ships creaking at anchor while autumn winds stirred the dark waters. The vessels carried not only Mongol warriors, but also Korean soldiers, Chinese siege engineers, and supplies enough to sustain a campaign on foreign shores. As the fleet departed, the coastline grew smaller and smaller until only the endless expanse of grey sea remained, punctuated by the rhythmic splash of oars and the snap of canvas sails catching the wind. The landing at Hakata Bay marked the first time Mongol forces had fought on terrain completely disconnected from their continental empire. Japanese defenders, samurai warriors trained in traditions entirely foreign to steppe warfare, met the invaders with curved swords and unwavering courage. The fighting that followed possessed a different character from the sweeping campaigns across Asian plains. Here, combat unfolded in narrow coastal valleys and upon beaches where the sound of clashing steel mingled with the constant whisper of waves against shore. Yet even as Mongol forces established their beachhead, nature itself seemed to conspire against their expansion. A typhoon, gathering strength far out at sea, approached with winds that would scatter ships like leaves and transform the invasion into a desperate struggle for survival. The retreat from Japan carried lessons that resonated throughout the empire like ripples spreading across still water. The Mongols had encountered not merely military resistance, but the fundamental challenge of projecting power across water barriers that could not be overcome through traditional siege tactics or cavalry charges. The sea, unlike any enemy they had previously faced, answered to no Khan and recognized no authority save the ancient patterns of wind and weather. Ships lost to storms could not be replaced with the same ease as fallen horses, and armies stranded on distant shores found themselves isolated from the vast supply networks that had sustained continental campaigns. Yet Kublai Khan's ambitions remained undaunted by this initial setback. The reconstruction of the invasion fleet proceeded with even greater determination, as if sheer scale could overcome the obstacles that had thwarted the first expedition. By 1281, an armada of unprecedented size gathered in Chinese and Korean ports, its thousands of vessels creating forests of masts that stretched along the coastlines like artificial harbours. This second invasion force dwarfed its predecessor, carrying over 100,000 warriors, sailors, and support personnel across ethnic lines that had once divided the empire's subjects. Chinese engineers working alongside Mongol commanders, Korean navigators guiding ships filled with warriors from the steppes. The second invasion of Japan unfolded like a tragic repetition of the first, yet magnified in scale and consequence. The initial landings achieved greater success, with Mongol forces establishing more secure footholds on Kyushu and advancing inland against fierce Japanese resistance. For weeks, the campaign seemed to validate Kublai's belief that overwhelming force could succeed where the earlier expedition had failed. Japanese defenders found themselves pressed back by siege engines that had reduced the walls of Baghdad and Beijing, while Mongol archers, though fighting on unfamiliar terrain, maintained their legendary accuracy in engagements that raged from dawn until dusk. But once again, the sea itself rose against the invaders with a fury that dwarfed any human resistance. The Great Typhoon of 1281 approached like divine judgment, its winds building to strengths that turned ships into splinters and transformed harbours into graveyards of broken masts and scattered cargo. The kamikaze, the divine wind as the Japanese would remember it, struck the Mongol fleet with such devastating force that entire squadrons vanished beneath towering waves. Those warriors who had conquered cities from Korea to Persia found themselves drowning in waters that cared nothing for their previous victories, their armor dragging them down into depths where neither courage nor tactical skill offered salvation. The aftermath of these Japanese expeditions marked a subtle but profound shift in Mongol imperial consciousness. The empire had encountered the absolute limits of its expansion, not through military defeat at human hands, but through collision with natural forces that remained forever beyond conquest. Ships could be built and rebuilt, fleets could be assembled and launched again, but the sea itself would always retain the power to destroy what armies could not defend against. The realization spread through the empire like the slow recognition of mortality, tempering the previously unlimited confidence that had driven expansion from the steppes to the South China Sea. Other maritime ventures followed, smaller in scale but equally revealing in their outcomes. Expeditions against Java and other Southeast Asian kingdoms encountered similar patterns. Initial military success followed by the grinding challenges of maintaining supply lines across unpredictable waters, establishing control over populations separated by sea barriers, and adapting steppe warfare traditions to tropical environments where horses struggled and traditional Mongol advantages dissolved. The Spice Islands, rich as they were, proved difficult to hold when monsoon seasons could cut off reinforcements for months at a time, leaving garrisons isolated in climates and cultures entirely foreign to their experience. The Vietnamese campaigns, though primarily overland, illustrated similar themes as Mongol forces pushed into regions where rivers and swamplands created water barriers almost as challenging as open seas. The dense jungles and intricate waterways of Southeast Asia absorbed Mongol armies like quicksand, turning swift cavalry attacks into grinding slogs through terrain where traditional mobility advantages evaporated in humid heat and tangled vegetation. Local defenders, intimately familiar with their environment, employed guerrilla tactics that frustrated commanders accustomed to decisive battles on open ground, where superior organization and discipline could determine outcomes. As these maritime and tropical campaigns unfolded across the latter decades of the 13th century, they revealed the geographical and logistical boundaries that would ultimately contain even the most successful empire in human history. The Mongol war machine, so perfectly adapted to the vast grasslands and established trade routes of the Eurasian continent, found itself operating at severe disadvantage when forced to project power across water barriers or through environments where horses could not function effectively. The sea remained unconquered, its storms and currents flowing according to patterns established long before humans first mounted horses or drew bows, indifferent to the rise and fall of earthly powers that had seemed, for a brief historical moment, capable of conquering the entire world. The great wheel of conquest, which had turned so relentlessly across the steppes and beyond for nearly 2 centuries, began to slow as the 13th century drew toward its close. Like autumn mist settling over the vast grasslands of Mongolia, a profound transformation crept across the empire that Genghis Khan had forged in fire and blood. The thundering hoofbeats that had once carried terror from the Pacific shores to the gates of Vienna now grew fainter, replaced by the softer sounds of settlement, the rustle of silk robes in Chinese courts, the scratch of quills on parchment in Persian chancelleries, the gentle chiming of silver coins in merchant houses stretching from Baghdad to Beijing. In the palaces of Karakorum, where once the great Kurultais had echoed with debates over which lands to conquer next, the descendants of the world's greatest conquerors found themselves drawn into increasingly subtle pursuits. The harsh discipline of the steppes, where survival depended on the swift draw of a bow and the endurance of both horse and rider, gave way to the refined pleasures of civilization. Mongol princes who had inherited the blood of Genghis Khan now spent their days in gardens perfumed with jasmine and rosewater, their evenings in libraries filled with scrolls of Chinese philosophy and Persian poetry. The transformation was as gradual as the changing of seasons, yet as inexorable as the flow of great rivers toward distant seas. Across the sprawling domains of the empire, local customs began to weave themselves into the fabric of Mongol rule, like threads of gold worked into dark wool. In China, the Yuan dynasty found itself adopting the elaborate ceremonials of the Mandate of Heaven, while Mongol administrators learned to navigate the intricate bureaucracies that had governed the Middle Kingdom for millennia. The conquest of bodies had been swift and brutal, but the conquest of minds and hearts proved to be a far more complex affair, one that flowed in both directions like tides meeting in some vast estuary. The Ilkhanate of Persia witnessed perhaps the most profound transformation of all. The descendants of Hulagu Khan, who had once destroyed Baghdad in a fury of flames and bloodshed, gradually embraced Islam with the fervor of converts. Ghazan Khan's conversion in 1295 marked not merely a personal spiritual journey, but the beginning of a complete cultural metamorphosis. Mongol nobles, who had once worshipped the eternal blue sky of their ancestors, now prostrated themselves in mosques built with stones taken from the ruins they had helped create. The irony was profound, yet peaceful. The destroyers became the builders. The conquerors became the defenders of the faith they had once sought to obliterate. In the lands of Rus, where the Golden Horde held sway over vast forests and frozen rivers, a different kind of absorption took place. Here, Orthodox Christianity and Mongol shamanism existed in an uneasy but gradually mellowing coexistence. The descendants of those who had burned Kiev learned to appreciate the haunting beauty of Orthodox liturgy, while Russian princes found themselves adopting aspects of Mongol administrative efficiency. The cultural exchange moved like slow, underground streams, surfacing unexpectedly in art, architecture, and the subtle rhythms of language itself. The great trade routes that had once carried armies now bore merchants whose caravans moved with the measured pace of careful commerce rather than conquest. The Pax Mongolica had created arteries of exchange that pulsed with the lifeblood of civilization. Spices from the Indies, silks from China, furs from the northern forests, and ideas that travelled even faster than goods. In the bazaars of Samarkand and the counting houses of Tabriz, Mongol gold mixed with silver from a dozen different realms, while languages blended and merged like streams converging in some vast delta. The physical transformation of the Mongols themselves became evident in the palaces and administrative centers scattered across their domains. Where once they had lived in felt yurts that could be struck and moved with the changing seasons, they now inhabited structures of brick and stone. Their walls decorated with frescoes that blended the artistic traditions of many lands. Gardens replaced pastures, fountains replaced streams, and the eternal horizon of the steppes was framed now by windows of coloured glass that filtered the light into jewelled patterns across marble floors. Language, that most intimate marker of identity, began its own slow dance of transformation. Mongol administrative documents increasingly bore the influence of Chinese, Persian, and Arabic. The harsh consonants and flowing vowels that had once carried the commands of conquerors across battlefields now adapted themselves to poetry, to philosophy, to the gentle discourse of scholars debating questions of law and theology. Words that had once meant raid and plunder found new meanings in contexts of trade and diplomacy. The military machine that had been the empire's beating heart gradually evolved into something altogether different. The tumans that had once swept across continents now found themselves stationed as garrison forces, their members increasingly drawn from local populations rather than the steppes. The composite bow, that masterpiece of nomadic warfare, gathered dust in armories while its wielders learned to appreciate the subtleties of siege engines and the patient craft of fortification. Warriors became administrators, raiders became tax collectors, and the children of those who had known only the open sky learned to read by lamplight in rooms warmed by braziers. Religious transformation followed its own mysterious currents. The Mongols had always been remarkably tolerant of other faiths, but tolerance gradually evolved into adoption and eventually into genuine embrace. Buddhist monasteries rose where military camps had once stood. Islamic schools of theology welcomed descendants of those who had once been their fiercest enemies. Christian churches found patrons among Mongol nobles whose grandfathers had worshipped the spirits of mountains and rivers. The spiritual landscape of the empire became as complex and varied as its physical terrain, with faiths flowing into one another like tributaries joining mighty rivers. Perhaps most profoundly, the very concept of what it meant to be Mongol began to shift and expand. In China, Mongol identity blended with Chinese civilization to create something entirely new. In Persia, it merged with Islamic culture and Persian artistic traditions. In Russia, it adapted to Orthodox Christianity and Slavic social structures. The empire that had been forged in the crucible of nomadic unity gradually fragmented, not through violent dissolution, but through a kind of cultural mitosis, each part adapting to its environment, while carrying within it the genetic memory of its steppe origins. The Great Yam, the postal system that had been the nervous system of the empire, continued to function even as political unity dissolved. Messages still travelled the ancient routes, but they carried different cargo now. Letters between merchants, treaties between increasingly independent kingdoms, and the correspondence of scholars sharing discoveries across vast distances. The infrastructure of conquest had become the foundation of a more peaceful kind of connection. As the 14th century dawned, the Mongol Empire existed less as a political entity than as a cultural memory, a shared heritage that linked disparate lands through common threads of history and tradition. The blood that had flowed so freely in conquest had mingled with the blood of 100 different peoples, creating new lineages that carried both the fierce pride of the steppes and the sophisticated wisdom of ancient civilizations. The great transformation was complete, yet never finished, for cultures continue to evolve like living things, always growing, always changing, always becoming something new while honoring what came before. In the end, perhaps the most lasting conquest of all was not of land or treasure, but of hearts and minds, achieved not through force of arms, but through the patient alchemy of time itself, transforming destroyers into builders, nomads into citizens of the world, and an empire of war into a legacy of enduring cultural exchange.